To understand these boys, you have to wrap your head around the place they called home and what was going on in it. Bronx NYC is also a character in this book. A dark shadow of neglect and lack of opportunities follows each of its neighborhoods, and some of it is explained by Green in this book. The Soundview houses were originally erected as a symbol of hope for low-income families. In the words of the author, and I'm paraphrasing pages 29 to 32 over here, groundbreaking took place at the corner of Randall and Rosedale Avenues, later known as Cozy Corner, on 23 September 1952. The architect for the project was a famous one, Marx Urbahn, who had helped design the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., and who went on to design prisons, military installations, the 42-story Franklin D. Roosevelt Station Post Office in Manhattan, and NASA's vertical, now vehicle, assembly building at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral. So far, so good. As you're reading it, you think, wow, what happened next to make it such a hell? No, Green takes you further back, from 1952 to 1939, when he insinuates something sinister occurred at the hands of a white man, Robert Moses, who is described in the book as, quote, arguably the most powerful man in the city, unquote. Born in 1888, Robert Moses served as the chairman of New York State Council of Parks from 1924 to 1963, almost 40 years. On his legacy, Green says on page 30, quote, he was seen either as a visionary creator of New York's future, or as argued persuasively in Robert Caro's The Power Broker, the racist engineer of the city's lasting inequalities. Unquote. It was Moses who in 1939 ordered the city's garbage be dumped in Soundview than on Rikers Island, thinking a park would be built over it. Pipe's grandmother used to say that the housing projects were built over Indian land, hence carried bad mojo. It was under his leadership that New York City Planning Commission gave a go-ahead for construction of a new low-rent public housing project called the Soundview Houses. This meant free gas and electricity at a fixed rate of $42 a month, with eligible tenants, annual income fixed at $2,700 for a family of 2 and $3,672 for a family of 5. Green writes further that Moses' inspiration for housing projects was the French architect Le Corbusier, who had developed the idea of vertical cities set in public parks, or towers in the park. It took 2 years to finish the 13 seven-story red brick buildings in 2 T-shaped sections called Soundview houses. Each floor was allotted to 1 white, 1 black, and 1 Hispanic family, with the last apartment going to the discretion of New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA. That's how similar towers were erected in Castle Hill, Bronx River, etc. I did not see anything racist in Moses' actions other than the perception that he created low-income housing project over a garbage dump, a site reserved for a park initially. This remote shadowland of southeast Bronx that Moses discovered in 1939 also offered sweeping views of Manhattan and Long Island Sound, so I didn't understand how he was the bad guy in all of this, other than the illusion that he gave favors to Democratic Party insiders in real estate deals. Maybe Green should have explained it further. Maybe he did not manage the influx of Puerto Ricans given citizenship rights under the Jones Act of 1917, who directly competed for space with black people fleeing Jim Crow laws of southern states, that enforced and maintained racial segregation? If so, Green should have elaborated, because migration and uncontrolled immigration is still a hot topic in US of A. Anyways, by mid-60s, Soundview House's neighborhood needed help, law enforcement's help, to maintain law and order, etc. This had nothing to do with drugs. This had everything to do with bad and fraudulent citizens. One landlord paying as little as $3 to a kid to burn his building so that he could get an insurance payout. Someone breaking into mailboxes, that sort of thing. By 1970s, white families, many of them Jewish, were a minority in Soundview houses, and drugs and violence was everywhere. This is exactly the time when John O'Malley's family, who lived near the Soundview housing projects, also moved from the area. By 1988, the Soundview houses complex accommodated around 1,250 families, mainly black and Puerto Rican. 3% were white. Roughly 40% were on welfare, and only 20 families had at least 2 family members working. To the east were the Castle Hill projects. Kids from the 2 projects saw each other as natural class enemies. In the no man's land between was Edli Stevenson High School, one of the most dangerous in America. That is the school Pistol Pete Rollock attended. 10 blocks from Soundview on neutral ground was the Kips Bay Boys and Girls Club. It was a safe midpoint where Soundview and Castle Hill kids could intermingle and play sports largely free of violence. Randall Avenue is the only way in and out of Soundview housing projects area, and that route took a life of its own in the Thanksgiving massacre, in which David Twin Mullins was taken out by Sean Sugar and his team on the orders of Pete Rollock. Quote, while the heroin trade had been largely controlled by the Mafia, who had the resources to buy kilos for $200,000 and import them to the US, crack was far more accessible. Colombian cartels flooded Miami with cheap cocaine, and a kilo could be had for as little as $10,000 before it was smuggled up the eastern seaboard. No need for massive international networks and large down payments. In New York, a 6 or 7 man crew could set up an operation, take over a block, and turn almost immediate profits. Unquote. This is on page 18. In 1988, as the author writes, 150,000 people toiled in the crack business in New York. And the author goes on to describe how Soundview began to look like a ghost town, with children and adults staying away from parks and streets, lest they become a casualty in the gun violence between rival drug dealers. Quote, black drug dealers murdering black drug dealers was a problem no one wanted to deal with. The murders of black kids barely made the papers. Forcelli, a cop, had seen boys in the Soundview neighborhoods come of age in the early days of crack, carrying out shootings before they had been through puberty. They reminded him of child soldiers in Africa, hardened to violence by years of exposure, eyes bloodshot from weed, and unquestioningly subservient to neighborhood gangsters who acted like rebel commanders. Forcelli had chased down kids armed with machine guns who had enough money stashed in their apartments to pay his salary for 5 years. Unquote. So it was necessary to get these kids off the streets, for their sake as well as that of the communities. Quote, New York City's 180 housing projects were patrolled by 15 public service areas, PSAs. PSA 8 covered around 25 square miles, or roughly half the Bronx. In it were 20 housing projects and 7 police precincts containing thousands of the poorest New Yorkers. Pete Forcelli, 20-year-old rookie cop, and white, learned in his first days that most cops in the projects were bound by the law of the street, and that this law would determine whether they would be respected. Unquote. On the other side of the spectrum was how the police were viewed by the black kids. Quote, to Pipe, the police had always represented the corrupt and repressive hand of the state. Ever since he could remember, they had torn his family apart. Some in their neighborhood believed that the poverty, the violence, the drugs, all of it, was the result of the white man's efforts to keep them down, to quarantine them in squalor and deprivation. Some asserted crack had been brought to the neighborhood by the CIA and the government so that young black men would kill each other off or be sent to giant prisons run by white men. By rights, O'Malley and Pipe should be at war forever. Unquote. In 1995, the same year as Pistol Pete Rollock's arrest, 31 members of the Bryant Boys and the Nasty Boys, two drug gangs from Hunts Point, Bronx, were indicted as well. Quote, the arrests transformed the neighborhood. The murder rate in 41st Precinct dropped 51% in the first 10 months following the arrests. Unquote. So once the members of SMM and Bryant Boys and Nasty Boys and all these other boys were rounded up and sifted from the streets, quote, in June 2001, in the same spot on Cozy Corner, where Robert Moses had sat for the groundbreaking ceremony of the Soundview houses, another ceremony began. Forcelli, La Barbera, Bob Ryan, and U.S. Attorney Mary Jo White sat amid lines of folding chairs facing a wooden rostrum with a placard that read, "Now entering a weed and seed community." In the wake of the weeding of sex money murder, federal grant had been siphoned to the Bronx DA, who in turn had set up a safe haven for children for after-school homework monitoring and some gardening and computer classes. Police officers had volunteered to teach kids karate and basketball. Unquote. Of course, much more is needed in such communities, and I feel these measures were half-baked and probably aimed more at just a photo op. The interesting thing to remember from this weed and seed ceremony is that the organizers of this ceremony bussed in federal prisoners on probation from other boroughs to wipe out the name SMM and the names of dead gangsters from the wall on Cozy Corner, that crossroad corner between Randall and Rosedale Avenues. And then students from IS 131 painted a vibrant jungle scene and an image of some visitors looking at paintings in an art gallery. They knew that no one from Soundview would like to be seen wiping out the SMM logo and names of dead drug dealers. Maybe some in the neighborhood supported the small-time petty gang. Maybe they feared them. Maybe they feared the reprisals. And then this. Someone splashed pink paint over this mural, defacing it. When it was fixed, it got tampered with again. And then Green writes, on page 339, quote, finally, members of the National Guard were called in to paint. Unquote. All this to make a point on the day of the weed and seed ceremony that, quote, the spirit represented by the wonderful murals hopefully signals the end of the SMM gang and a new bright beginning for the neighborhood. Unquote. And murder rates did drop after drug gangs were arrested and convicted under RICO, federal racketeering laws. Jonathan Green shares plenty of statistics in this book. On page 62, he says, quote, murder hung in the air like a viral mist. In 1988, the number of killings in NYC would soar by 10.4% over the previous year. Nationally, white young American men of all races killed each other at the rate of 21.9% per 100,000. Young black males were murdered at almost 4 times that rate, at 85.6 per 100,000 in 1987. Unquote. The majority of these deaths were at the hands of other black males. From 1990 to 2000, crime dropped in New York City twice as much as in any other major city. As Green writes, it became known as the American Miracle. The biggest decrease in homicides in all boroughs was in the Bronx. By 2015, when Green interviewed O'Malley, $400,000 condos were available for purchase in Soundview. O'Malley told Green, quote, no one invests in an area where bullets are flying. Unquote. However, Jonathan Green also noticed the new gangs controlling the area. Quote, a new Crips set, the Stratford Avenue Crew, rubbed against the territory dominated by the Morrison Avenue Boys, a blood set. Unquote. And that's the most ironical part of all. The violence neither started with SMM nor did it end with the capture of its original members. New drug gangs took the vacuum left by SMM and Nasty Boys at Soundview, Castle Hill, and beyond. Green even mentions a young homicide detective from the 43rd Precinct who told him, quote, we arrest gang bangers and they talk about Pistol Pete like he's some Robin Hood. I'm like, he didn't give anything to you or your family. Why is he Robin Hood to you? Then they look at me like I'm the one who's nuts. Unquote. And despite all of it, there's a legacy that Pistol Pete Rollock left behind. John Carameneca of the New York Times did a piece on Brian Valmond, who covers black drug lords, dealers, and gangs on his social media platforms, especially through his Twitter handle ValTown. He told Carameneca in 2024, quote, the Italian Mafia, they are all in the media. They are glamorized and they have their underworld legends, whereas the black underworld is very villainized as predators. So I wanted to show not to glorify it, but say, we have our underworld legends as well. Unquote. When I read Green's book on SMM, that's the feeling I got too, that Pipe and Sean Sugar were depicted as Ray Liotta's characters from Scorsese's Goodfellas, while law enforcement officers and DA's office members felt like Costner's crew from The Untouchables. And this book shows the uncomfortable but symbiotic coexistence of rap, hip-hop music, and gang activities. Names are thrown here and there of everyone from P. Diddy, whose father was allegedly an associate of Nicky Barnes, just like Rollock's father, Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur, both of whom were killed over rival gang affiliations or tussles, Crips and Bloods. Even J-Lo gets a sentence for getting into a quarrel with Pipe's sister, but the nature of this alignment nor its causes are covered in the book. There's a point in the book that I wish was clarified further. O'Malley's grandmother had lived in Clason Point Gardens, a neighborhood behind Soundview houses. Both were low-income housing projects, but Clason Point Gardens was rarely in trouble. In fact, on page 340, there's a passage that I wish Jonathan Green had elaborated on. And considering that this is a 413-page book that looks at crime and punishment and life on the streets from all sides, I wish he could have spared a few more sentences to explain the following. Quote, in 1969, the city planner and architect Oscar Newman redesigned Clason Point Gardens, a project of 2-story houses, each with a small garden that is right behind Soundview houses, giving residents a real personal stake in their homes. After his improvements, the overall crime rate in Clason Point Gardens dropped 54% in the first year. Looking up at the Soundview houses around him, Forcelli wondered if, given those same housing opportunities, the lives of people here could be improved. Unquote. I did not get what Forcelli meant by that. I think Green should have explained what kind of a personal stake Clason Point Gardens residents got in their homes that reduced the crime rate over there. Reading the book, I felt the black family system needed to be made stronger, ensuring sons don't grow up without fathers, and that black people needed to take greater ownership of their own problems. For example, black kids killing other black kids, and make better, healthier choices. I could also see that the local government needs to invest in the projects beyond the cosmetic and artificial mural, paint jobs, and karate lessons by volunteer cops. It's obvious in the book that when industries are moved overseas or to non-unionized areas, they create unemployment. Heavily populated places that are also full of unemployed or low-paying blue-collar workers provide fertile ground for criminal activities to turn towards a life of crime. Plus, unfiltered or unregulated migration fatigues local resources. There's a criminal defense lawyer, Bruce Rivers, who, after the suicide of his wife, raised his kids alone. In one of his last posted videos, before his son's death, his son Michael Rivers, who was the producer and director for the videos, Bruce Rivers commented on yet another gangster rapper talking shit. Quote, "Being a badass is going to work every day and being boring, tucking your kid in at night, and that you don't have to look over your shoulder." Unquote.